The JSF, I don't know if you saw, there was a little display inside for it.
This scout troop is on an outing to a naval museum just outside of Washington DC. A retired Marine sergeant is giving them a guided tour of one of the museum's prize exhibits.
Okay. Now we'll tell you a little bit about the sea sprite here. This particular bird is a sub-hunter. This thing had a great history in its flight time, and it was retired here to the museum. But a unique thing that you don't know.
The Sea Sprite naval helicopter, first flown in the 1950s, is now a museum piece in the United States. It was phased out of service from the early 90s, and by 2001, the US had put its few remaining Sea Sprites into storage. But remarkably, the Royal Australian Navy has spent over $1 billion on these museum pieces. It bought 11 of the ageing helicopters and has spent the last 7 years trying to convert them into state-of-the-art war machines. Most are older than the Sea Sprite on display in the US, and some even flew in the Vietnam War. The Australian Defence Department has a long history of embarrassing blunders on major projects. But the story of the Sea Sprite helicopter is possibly the most shocking to emerge so far. How would you sum up the Sea Sprite deal in total?
Oh, it's been a disaster. We paid $1 billion for 40-year-old aircraft that have been delivered 3 years late, still haven't got a weapons system. It's just been a complete disaster.
Should have the Sea Sprite been cancelled?
Oh, certainly. I mean, the fact is, I don't think you can justify adding yet another helicopter to our inventory with all...
Aldo Borgu is a former advisor to 3 coalition defence ministers and is now an analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He explains how the Sea Sprite project came about.
Certainly the major requirement was because we actually had a smaller ship, the Offshore Patrol Combatant or Offshore Patrol Vessel, which we were basically putting together jointly with Malaysia. It couldn't carry a Seahawk helicopter, which can be carried on the Anzac frigate, so if we were proceeding just with the Anzacs, we probably would have gone for the existing Seahawk helicopter. But because we also had this smaller ship, which was banking on the fact that the Malaysians would buy it, so we'd have a joint development program, we needed a smaller size helicopter, which would have been either the Sea Sprite or the Westland Lynx.
Being small was the one thing the Sea Sprite had going for it. This is the offshore patrol vessel designed for the joint Malaysian-Australian project. The size of this rear helicopter deck meant that Australia's existing Seahawk helicopters would be too large to land on the ship. Under questioning in Senate estimates hearings, Defence officials admitted that this was the sole reason the Sea Sprite was bought.
Did we purchase the Sea Sprites because they had a superior anti-surface capability, or was it more to do with the size?
It was entirely to do with the size, Senator. There is a variant of the Seahawk that carries the Penguin missile, the same missile.
So effectively we could have got the same capability out of the Seahawk if it wasn't for the size question. Is that fair?
Yes.
Aldo Borgu agrees that it was all about size.
It's the only explanation I can come up with. I mean, it's the only reason why we wouldn't have gotten additional Seahawk helicopters, similar to the ones that we operate on the Adelaide-class frigates, and I can't see any other reason. I mean, the platform itself doesn't have any unique capabilities that would cause you to buy the Sea Sprite over the Seahawk.
The only problem was that this glossy brochure was as far as the offshore patrol vessel ever got. When Malaysia pulled out in October 1997, the ship was finally canned, and with it went any justification for a smaller Navy helicopter. But for reasons that have never been fully explained, the Defence Department had already signed the Sea Sprite contract 4 months earlier, even though it was known by then in government circles that the joint project with Malaysia would probably not go ahead. Opposition Defence spokesman, Senator Chris Evans, has been pursuing the Navy over the Sea Sprite deal for years. But on this critical point, he's drawn a blank. Why do you think the Defence Department went ahead with the Sea Sprite, even though the offshore patrol vessel was cancelled?
Look, it's a complete mystery to me. There's been no proper explanation of that. The helicopter was designed for a ship that was cancelled, but we went ahead and ordered the helicopter even though the capability was no longer going to be purchased.
The Defence Department was unable to provide anyone for an interview with Dateline.
Yes.
But it's previously claimed that once it signed the Sea Sprite contract, there was no going back.
Isn't it the case that you could have settled for the Seahawk?
Would have meant breaking the contract with Command.
No, in the absence of the contract. If the contract hadn't been signed, then wouldn't we have just got more Seahawks?
That was certainly an option we could have pursued, Senator. It's a hypothetical situation. I don't know what our decision would have been.
All right.
Once we decided that we don't need the offshore patrol vessel anymore, we should have decided that we don't need the Sea Sprite anymore and just gone with a far more simpler solution in terms of getting additional Seahawk helicopters. There is this point about once a project gets approved, certainly by Cabinet, let alone moving into the acquisition phase, I don't think, Defence naturally doesn't want to walk away from it, bird in the hand worth two in the bush type sort of scenario. But the problem is that's irrespective of how many problems it actually comes up against. So, I mean, I've never met a project that Defence didn't like.
Undeterred by no longer having the ship it was designed for, Defence went ahead with the Sea Sprite and was given two options by the manufacturer, Command Aerospace. Command could either restart its production line and build totally new helicopters, or it could hunt around for old Sea Sprites that had been retired and rebuild them. Defence chose this cheaper second option, but as Opposition Defence spokesman Chris Evans discovered, these old airframes were not entirely up to scratch.
The contractor, in order to meet your specifications, has decided that some of these frames, up to 70%, has to be replaced. Is that fair? Or?
That's correct, yes.
Right.
70% of the
So,
that includes engines and something.
I guess I just having difficulty coming to terms with why one would want 30% of an airframe to start a new multi-million-dollar project.
Senator, the reason existing frames were used were because the company tendered an additional price of $32 million to build new aircraft from scratch.
Yes. Are you saying to me you think the contractor thought they'd get away with more of the old frames than they have?
Yes, they did.
Yeah. And so you think they've had to rebuild more of it than they'd envisaged when they first tendered for the...
I've been told so, yes, Senator.
Okay. What sort of hours would these airframes already have flown? Did any of them serve in the Vietnam War, by the way? Any of them fly in the Vietnam War?
From their build dates, it would appear so.
In fact, according to Defence, some of the Sea Sprite airframes date back to 1963 and have already been rebuilt at least twice.
The airframes themselves were stored at a US storage facility, and the Commonwealth sent a team of experts, engineering experts, to pick those airframes that were in the best condition. Now, the life of
is this one of these desert things I've got?
Yes.
Yes. So which one were they at?
They're at near Davis Monthan. I think they call it AMARC, AMARC. It stands for something. I can find out what the acronym stands for.
And that means they're stored out in the desert, is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
AMARC, or the Aircraft Maintenance and Regeneration Centre, is a massive parking lot where the US keeps aircraft it no longer has any use for. There's almost 4,500 planes and helicopters stored out here in the Arizona desert. It's hard to find a more graphic display of military might and the amount of money that the US is prepared to spend on defence. These B-1B nuclear bombers were virtually redundant from the first day they were flown. They cost around $300 million US apiece and there's 18 of them in mothballs here.
I don't think I want to know how much those things are worth out there. I mean, as a taxpayer, I just don't want to know.
Larry Kotz has an office on the edge of Amark and makes a living buying up old military aircraft for either parts or scrap. He's currently working over these C-141 transport jets.
All these airframes were timed out during the Gulf War back in '91. So the U.S. government has sold them off essentially for scrap, but part of the criteria is there can be nothing left of the airframe. So your next refrigerator, your next car may have a C-141's heart inside. The majority of material out there is left over from the Cold War. In some cases, they're getting either reuse, reutilization out of the assets they have parked out there, or they'll use foreign aid credits from other countries, and a lot of this stuff will go overseas. But probably the majority of what's out there is going to end up like these C-141s. They'll end up just being scrapped out. I mean, you have a gigantic inventory of, billions of dollars worth of aircraft that essentially has no use anymore.
Larry also salvages spare parts from Sea Sprite helicopters and sells them to the New Zealand Navy.
We provide the parts that Command doesn't necessarily build. So we either sell them to Command and Command sells them to New Zealand, or in a lot of cases, just because Command's a big company and sometimes we can do things a little bit faster, we'll sell directly to New Zealand.
This is where Larry's parts come from. Tucked away in a corner of Amark are these 50 or so old Sea Sprites. Australia's second-hand airframes also came from this fleet, and according to base officials, 7 more have been put aside for a possible future purchase.
The oil that you see coming out there, that is just a residual oil from when they ran the engines. And
Tim Horn is from the Navy office at Amark.
Evidently Australia came into the International Programs Office in the US Navy and requested a certain amount of SH-2 aircraft. So the IPO asked us to put these aircraft aside and hold them for Australia whenever that point in time comes when they want to come in here and take the aircraft.
The cockpit ceiling here, is it sprayed on or something?
Yeah, it's called Spraylat, and it's a latex coating, and it sprays on, and it can be peeled right off. At the end of the Cold War, most of these aircraft were used for anti-submarine warfare, and they just brought in the H-60 and other aircraft that they felt probably do a better job.
And these, from what I understand, the Sea Sprite's been retired by the US. It's not being flown anymore?
Right, they're not flying anymore in the US Navy.
And this is an Australian one, or the two on the end, they're the Australian ones, are they?
The Australian ones are, these two right here are slated for Australia, 028 and 039.
Dateline has established from US Defence Department records that when these choppers were put into storage, they were each valued at around 600,000 American dollars. By the time the Australian project is finished, we'll have effectively spent around $100 million getting each one of our 11 Sea Sprites into the air. It may be $1 billion project for Australia, but US records show that since the early 90s, the United States has been trying to give away its old Sea Sprites as part of military aid packages. And despite the fact that the Americans were offering free helicopters, in at least 3 cases they were knocked back. Greece in 1993, Turkey in 1994, and Thailand in 1997. Did you know that the United States has been trying to give away the Sea Sprite to a number of countries?
No, I didn't know that. I suppose it shouldn't surprise me, but this is just the final nail, I suppose, in the coffin of the story.
But defence sources claim that the most serious blunder with the Sea Sprite are the sophisticated electronics and weapons that Australia's tried to cram into a 1950s design. Australia's Sea Sprites are being fitted with advanced systems that allow the helicopter to be flown by a crew of 2 instead of 3, and to find and destroy targets without the help of a mothership.
Hello, sir. How you doing? How you doing? Thank you. Sir, how you doing?
Robert Hill, the Minister for Defence, was given a demonstration of the system in October last year.
All right, fully glass cockpit.
Full glass cockpit, sir. This is what sets our Sea Sprite apart from many other Sea Sprites. Essentially, this is the unique capability which gives us the ability to have a two-man crew. It's a quantum leap forward from everything we've got in the ADF. It's the future.
And they're more or less the same.
But getting these systems to actually work has proved to be an expensive technical nightmare. The US subcontractor pulled out in frustration, and a messy legal wrangle has been the main cause of a 3-year delay in the delivery of the Sea Sprite.
Obviously a lot of technical heartache's gone into the end result of reducing the crew by one person. Do you think that was a good call?
I think it was an extremely risky decision, and I think that events have proved that Navy was overconfident. When you do the sums on the savings achieved by reducing the one crewman, they have been well and truly eaten up by the cost increase in this system, which by now has doubled in over its original estimated costs.
Every time you try to put advanced avionics and systems in an old platform, you run into problems. Every time you try to integrate new weapons onto an old platform, you're going to run into problems. And before you actually try to commit, billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars to these sorts of projects, have a good sense about how realistic it is, what you're trying to actually achieve.
Dateline has spoken to several US defence sources who were stunned by the complexity of the systems Australia planned for the Sea Sprite. As far as Larry Kotz is concerned, it would have been better to keep it simple.
That wasn't done in Australia's case. They bought the whole, kitchen with the sink and the automatic dishwasher and the refrigerator freezer, and they put it all in. And they've had some growing pains. Now, my understanding is they're on track with getting that done. And by the time they're done, they're going to have a very cool system. It's going to be able to, track 8 targets at the same time and do all kinds of, nifty things. Whether that was a good way to go in the very beginning or to done it slowly, it's kind of too late to worry about it now since it's already a done issue. If I was going to do it, I would have done it on made a more simpler package closer to what the New Zealanders did.
The New Zealand Navy bought 4 old Sea Sprites for training and parts, and then a further 5 brand new choppers. These new Sea Sprites were bought virtually off the shelf and use a missile system already tested by the US and have been in operation for the last 3 years. For its 9 Sea Sprites, the New Zealand Navy spent around $290 million, compared to the $1.1 billion Australia will spend on 11. Australia's first Sea Sprite was officially accepted at this ceremony in October last year, but for training only and without any weapons system. The Australian Navy hopes to have its Sea Sprite squadron operational by the middle of next year. But Robert Hill was clearly relieved just to see an Australian Sea Sprite flying, even if it was without weapons.
You never thought you'd see the day on it?
The Super Sea Sprite project has attracted its fair share of negative publicity, and yes, it is 3.5 years late, whilst remaining within budget. The delay has come about by the usual challenges faced by projects introducing leading-edge technology. The Defence Material Organisation has learnt several important lessons from the progress of this program, which we've heeded.
One of those lessons was how to write a contract. When Defence agreed to buy the Sea Sprite, it also paid for a 10-year maintenance contract. But it forgot to link the two, and as the project lagged further and further behind, Defence faced a $30 million maintenance bill for helicopters that had yet to arrive.
Did you find that shocking though, that you can be paying for a maintenance contract and not actually have the helicopter present and that there's no linkage in time between the two, that you're actually paying for.
It's ridiculous, and I don't think anybody can basically argue against that.
It got to the stage where it was like, yes, Minister. I mean, we had paid the money up front. We were actually maintaining a maintenance facility for the helicopters, even though we didn't have the helicopters. So it was like the Yes Minister episode with the hospital without patients. And it just got totally farcical.
In defence circles, the Sea Sprite has become a byword for expensive bungling. At almost every stage of the project, whenever a mistake could be made, it was. First, there was the decision to buy a helicopter for a ship that was never built. The decision to develop sophisticated, one-off electronic systems for our small fleet of choppers almost guaranteed that they'd run into expensive delays. And because of the way the Sea Sprite deal had been structured, the more Defence got into the mess, the more they decided they couldn't afford to get out.
There is a strange perversity in the real world action of public finance, which is that the more expensive a project, the less likely it is to be cancelled. The real reason is because, of course, of political and bureaucratic embarrassment at having to explain why so much money was spent on a project that was ultimately canned.
I mean, there's a lot of discussion at the moment in terms of, we live in a period of increased uncertainty, increased threat of terrorism and all those sorts of issues. It leads to a lot of debate about how you need to increase defence funding. I think my point would be is, if I was the government, I wouldn't be giving any extra money to Defence until Defence proves that it can spend the money that it's getting already wisely. And I don't think we're at that point yet where Defence can actually do that.